My parents only saw me as someone to work for them. When I started my own sports store, they tried to take it over. My dad hit me with a bat from my store, and then he sued me. Hey everyone, I've never really opened up about this before, but after reading through so many stories here, I feel it's time to share mine. It's hard to express the depth of what I've endured, but perhaps sharing will help me heal. So, here's my story. On the surface, my family seemed perfectly normal. We lived in a nice home, my parents were employed, and nobody outside would ever guess anything was amiss. But behind closed doors, the reality was starkly different. My parents saw me not as their child, but as unpaid labor. From my earliest memories, I was treated less like a family member and more like a servant born solely to serve them. My father, whom I'll call John here, was a stern figure descending from a lineage of hardworking farmers who prized physical labor over emotional expression, viewing any display of feelings as a sign of weakness. My mother, whom I'll refer to as Martha, was equally tough in her own way. She supported every one of John's decisions, never physically abusive herself, but entirely complicit. Her passive acceptance of the situation was perhaps more damaging than any physical abuse could be. She never shielded me from John's harsh discipline. It wasn't the dramatic sort of abuse you might see in films, with a villainous abuser lashing out in visible rage. It was subtler, more systematic. John didn't strike me merely out of anger, but to assert his dominance, to shape me into the obedient figure he envisioned, stripping me of any semblance of autonomy. The control was suffocating, all-encompassing. From the tender age of 6, my daily routine was grueling labor in the fields, planting, harvesting, tending to animals. Instead of childhood pastimes like video games or cycling, I was entrenched in farm duties. Mistakes were met with harsh penalties. I was constantly reminded that I wasn't to behave like a child. I recall a particularly grueling day when I was about 9, under the oppressive heat of a midsummer sun that seemed to hover directly overhead. I had been working since dawn, and my young body was on the verge of collapse. I collapsed, exhausted and overheated, lying in the dirt while struggling for breath as if my very skin was on fire. Instead of offering help or even a moment's respite, my father yanked me up by the collar and hauled me to the barn. His voice, chillingly calm, cut through the air. "You don't stop when you're tired. You stop when I say it's enough." That moment crystallized the harsh truth for me. To my parents, I was not a son. I was merely an instrument for their use. My mother was just as indifferent. She would toss me a cloth and coldly instruct me to clean up, as if these moments of cruelty were just routine. Her eyes, void of warmth, looked through me like I was just another task on her list to be managed. Afterward, she would casually return to her daily tasks or her leisurely phone calls with friends from her church group, completely detached. School became my sanctuary, a stark contrast to my home life. There, I was free from the constant berating and physical pain. I was treated like any other student, not belittled or abused. While the teachers remained oblivious to my home life and I kept my silence, seeing no point in sharing, school offered a temporary escape. I immersed myself in literature and history, relishing the stories that transported me to realms vastly different from my own harsh reality. One book that resonated deeply with me was S.E. Hinton's The Outsiders. I pored over it repeatedly, drawn to Ponyboy's reflections on belonging nowhere. His feelings mirrored my own isolation. While my peers enjoyed the support and affection of their families shown in their participation in school events and everyday affections which were foreign to me, I found solace in Ponyboy's words and felt a little less isolated. By high school, I had honed the art of concealing the truth of my family life. I maintained the facade of normalcy and even nurtured a few close friendships with peers like Tom, Lisa, and Marcus, who knew nothing of the reality I faced each day after school. We connected in our freshman year, and it was the first time I felt I had found my place. Tom was the group's comedian, always ready with a joke to lighten the atmosphere. Lisa was our intellectual powerhouse, incredibly sharp and clearly headed for success. Marcus played the role of the peacemaker, the one who kept us unified. They knew little about the struggles I faced at home. I kept it that way, offering up excuses like heavy homework loads or overly strict parents whenever I had to decline hanging out after school. In reality, my father restricted my activities strictly to school or farm work. At home, though, schoolwork was my refuge. I devoted myself to my studies with the goal of escaping my oppressive environment. College was the beacon of hope on my horizon. I pushed myself, securing scholarships, and eventually, acceptance to a university 3 hours away felt like breaking free from shackles. The day the acceptance letter arrived was pivotal. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope, half expecting another rejection. Seeing the word congratulations almost brought me to tears, though I quickly composed myself. Emotions were a luxury I couldn't afford, a vulnerability that could be exploited. Announcing my departure to my parents was met with indifference. My father barely acknowledged me, his attention glued to the TV, and my mother remained silent. To them, my leaving was merely a reduction in household expenses and labor. I left without farewells, not once looking back. College was a revelation. For the first time, I experienced true freedom and the joy of breathing without a weight on my chest. It was here that I began to form genuine connections with people who cared about me, a stark contrast to the life I had left behind. True friends who embraced their emotions openly and never judged me for my occasional quietness or distance. For the first time, I felt genuinely free to be myself. Tom, Lisa, and Marcus also chose the same university, and together, we rented an apartment just off campus. It felt like we had broken free from our respective pasts. The city was expansive, brimming with possibilities, and we were eager to seize every opportunity. Initially, everything seemed perfect. We balanced our time between partying, studying, and exploring the urban landscape, allowing me to entertain the possibility of a happier life. However, as life tends to do, our situation began to unravel. Tom fell in with a crowd that prioritized nightlife over academics. Lisa, usually so conscientious, became involved with a manipulative and detrimental partner. Marcus appeared outwardly stable, but was quietly grappling with deep-seated depression, a battle he seldom shared. The pivot came one night at a college party, a celebration for the semester's end. It was the typical scene: blaring music, excessive drinking, and throngs of people. Feeling overwhelmed by the chaos and not fond of large gatherings, I decided to head home early. As I was leaving, Marcus called. His voice was slurred, laden with the sorrow of one who's borne too much alone for too long. He urgently asked me to come to the apartment as he needed to talk. Concerned but unaware of the severity of the situation, I hurried back. Upon arrival, I found the apartment door worryingly ajar. I stepped inside, calling out for Marcus, but was met with silence. I found him in his bedroom, seated on the bed's edge, a vacant look in his eyes and an empty whiskey bottle by his side, his hands trembling visibly. He raised his eyes to meet mine, their depth reflecting a haunting emptiness. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. My gaze immediately fell to the half-empty bottle of pills on the nightstand, and a cold fear gripped me. I rushed to his side, desperately trying to reassure him, to convince him that things could improve, that he wasn't isolated in his struggles. But my words seemed hollow to him. He repeatedly murmured about his exhaustion and inability to continue the fight. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as I sat with him, gripped by the fear of him harming himself in front of me, of being unable to prevent a tragedy. I pleaded with him to let me call for help, but he resisted, warning that he'd be gone before anyone could arrive. Finally, in his inebriated and despondent state, he relinquished the pills to me. I stayed by his side throughout the night, vigilant and ensuring he was still breathing, that he hadn't given in to his despair. By dawn, he was unconscious, and I seized the moment to alert Lisa and Tom about the crisis. That night marked a turning point for us all. Soon after, Marcus withdrew from university, stating he needed to return home to escape the pressures of city life. Lisa, trapped in a damaging relationship, grew more isolated from us. Tom spiraled further, embracing a path of excess and ultimately flunking out of school. As for myself, I persevered, resolved not to let my past or the choices of my friends define my future. My life had been a constant struggle to break free from the chains of my upbringing, and I refused to succumb to them now. Yet, even as I write this, I ponder whether true freedom is attainable. The scars from my past are profound, and no matter how much distance I put between them and myself, they linger, ever present just below the surface. Perhaps that's the real reason I'm sharing this story. I once thought escaping my old home would solve everything, but it might just be the start of understanding and confronting these deep-seated issues. Thank you for reading this far. I just needed to share. If anyone has any insights on how to navigate the heaviness of all this, I'm open to suggestions. Hello again, everyone. I didn't plan on returning so soon, but after my last post, I realized there's still a lot left to unpack. Writing everything down has been somewhat therapeutic, and this next chapter isn't just about the struggle. It's also about discovering hope, rebuilding what was shattered, and potentially emerging even stronger. However, as is often the case, the path wasn't smooth and there were numerous setbacks. Following Marcus's departure from university and the city, our close-knit group began to disintegrate rapidly. Lisa remained in her harmful relationship, and Tom continued to descend further into his self-destructive behaviors. I felt adrift, unsure of how to mend the fractures within our group. How does one extend help to others when they are just about holding themselves together? Reflecting on my childhood, where I was viewed merely as an asset rather than a person, I feared I might crumble like my friends. That fear had propelled me forward for years, keeping me focused on my objectives amidst the chaos. But I came to understand that I couldn't let fear dominate me any longer. It was time to assert control over my life and perhaps assist my friends in doing the same. I started with Marcus. After he moved away, we lost contact for a period, as I wanted to respect his need for space while also fearing for his well-being, knowing his battle with depression wouldn't just vanish by changing locations. Eventually, I mustered the courage to call him, half expecting to hear his voicemail as usual. To my surprise, he answered. His voice was hoarse, indicative of many sleepless nights. It was clear he was still grappling with his demons. We spoke casually at first, skirting around the deeper issues. I didn't press him, but I made it clear I was there, a steadfast presence in his life. Over the following weeks, our conversations grew more frequent and deeper, and slowly, he began to open up. He shared that he had begun therapy back in his hometown to sort through the turmoil within his mind. Hearing this brought me a sense of relief. It was a modest step, yet significant. I encouraged him to persist, to keep pushing forward even when progress seemed out of reach. We made a commitment. He would continue with his therapy sessions, and I would check in on him weekly. Our bond had deepened beyond mere friendship. We were more like brothers, united by our shared struggles and now jointly striving towards recovery. A few months later, Marcus surprised me with a call. He expressed a desire to return to the city. He wasn't prepared to let go of his ambitions or resign himself to a life at his parents' home indefinitely. This marked a pivotal moment for him, and his determination was palpable in his voice. Soon after, he returned to the city, and we helped him settle into a new apartment close to mine. Gradually, Marcus began piecing his life back together. On the other hand, Tom's challenges were more visible and immediate. His issues involved excessive drinking, late-night partying, and increasingly reckless behavior. I could see he was on a dangerous trajectory that could lead to severe consequences. One night, I felt compelled to address it. We were in our living room, a noticeable tension hanging between us. Tom stumbled in, visibly intoxicated, and collapsed onto the couch. I took a seat across from him, uncertain of how to begin. It wasn't as simple as just telling him to stop, but I felt compelled to intervene. Softly, I began, "Tom, this isn't you." He initially dismissed me, murmuring that I couldn't possibly understand, but I did understand all too well. I had witnessed the destructive power of addiction firsthand. My father had been consumed by alcohol for years. I was determined not to watch my best friend go down that same destructive path. In the following weeks, I did my best to support Tom, though it was far from easy. He often resisted, and there were nights he would return home inebriated, hurling insults because I tried to intervene. However, I understood his anger wasn't truly directed at me. It was rooted in his frustrations with himself and the life he felt trapped in. I finally persuaded him to attend just one support group meeting to see if it might make a difference. Reluctantly, he agreed, and that session proved to be a turning point. Gradually, Tom began to reduce his drinking. He connected with others who shared similar struggles, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so isolated. The battle was daily, but now he was actively fighting. Lisa, however, was more challenging to reach. She was deeply entangled in a toxic relationship with a guy named Nick, who had been diminishing her for over a year. I could see how he isolated and demeaned her, convincing her she was worthless without him. It infuriated me, but I felt powerless as she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge the reality of her situation. She remained ensnared by his deception, mistaking his manipulation for love. It wasn't until one harrowing night following a particularly vicious altercation with Nick that Lisa turned up at my door, tears streaming down her face. She had reached her breaking point and had nowhere else to turn. I listened as she detailed the relentless arguments, the manipulation, and how demeaned she felt. In that moment, I resolved not to let her return to him. I offered her a place to stay on my couch, providing the refuge she needed to sort through her thoughts. Marcus and Tom also came around to lend their support. Together, we reminded her of her former self, the assertive, resilient Lisa who stood up for herself. It took some time, but gradually she began to reclaim that strength. Escaping Nick's grasp wasn't straightforward. One night, he appeared at Lisa's apartment, banging on the door and demanding to see her. The fear in Lisa's eyes was evident, but it was tinged with a newfound resolve. She was determined not to let him dominate her life anymore. It was at that moment I realized Lisa had reclaimed her strength. With our support, Lisa moved out of the apartment she shared with Nick, secured a new place, changed her phone number, and cut all digital ties with him as she started piecing her life back together. She resumed her education, refocused on her studies, and slowly rediscovered herself. The journey was lengthy, but with each passing day, she became stronger. During this time, I too began to carve out my own path. My passion for fitness and sports, a refuge from my troubled childhood, had always been a source of solace. Working out was not just exercise for me, it was a therapeutic release for my pent-up anger and frustration, transforming them into something positive. Seizing a newfound opportunity, I decided to venture into entrepreneurship. Initially, it was merely a concept. I had been employed at a local gym, conducting training sessions and absorbing all aspects of the business. Yet, I yearned for something more substantial than just employment. I wanted to create something of my own. Taking a risk, I opened a small sports equipment shop. It was a humble beginning with a simple storefront funded largely by my savings to stock high-quality gear ranging from running shoes to weightlifting equipment. The venture was daunting and the anxiety was palpable, but so was my determination. I had always strived for better, and this was my opportunity to achieve it. Remarkably, the shop began to flourish. It started with a handful of devoted customers, acquaintances from the gym, and friends who supported my vision. Word of mouth spread rapidly about our shop. More customers started coming through the doors, drawn not only by the quality of the gear, but also by the way we engaged with them. I had founded the business on the principle that everyone deserves to feel empowered to take charge of their own health and fitness, regardless of their starting point. This ethos resonated deeply with our patrons. Soon, the influx of customers necessitated an expansion in staff. Initially, it was just a couple of employees to assist with the daily operations, but as demand grew, so did our team. I brought on board trainers, nutritionists, and even local athletes to enhance our brand's credibility and outreach. We began to offer classes and workshops, fostering a community centered around our store. Our mission evolved beyond merely selling equipment. We were now in the business of transforming lives. With growth, however, came increased pressure. My days were filled with endless tasks, from inventory and marketing to direct customer interactions. There were moments I felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities, but failure was not an option. After everything I had overcome, giving up was simply not in my playbook. Then, a significant challenge arose with one of our suppliers. They delivered substandard products while charging premium prices, and when I confronted them, they threatened to stop supplying us altogether, jeopardizing a large portion of our inventory. The prospect of disappointing our customers was daunting, but I refused to yield. I sought out new suppliers, forged fresh partnerships, and ultimately strengthened our business's foundation. The lessons were tough but invaluable, instilling in me an even greater resolve to succeed. Then, a day came that tested my resolve like never before. I arrived one morning to find the store vandalized, our front window smashed and shelves emptied. Standing amidst the chaos, it felt as though all my efforts were disintegrating before my eyes. Instead of succumbing to despair, I took action and began piecing everything back together. With the invaluable support of my friends and my dedicated team, we reconstructed and fortified our operations. We installed security systems, streamlined our processes, and emerged more robust than before. What began as a modest sports equipment store evolved into something far greater than I had ever envisioned. Our business was more than just a commercial venture. It became a family, My colleagues and our patrons joined together to create a truly unique community. We supported one another, striving for personal and collective growth and facing life's hurdles united. Throughout all of this, Marcus, Tom, and Lisa were right there with me. They each had their own battles and challenges, yet we faced them together. We had weathered severe storms and were now constructing something beautiful from the remnants. Reflecting on my journey from a neglected farm kid to a successful business owner and supportive friend, I've come to understand what true freedom means. The message I want to share is this: no matter the depths of the darkness, there is always a path forward. There is always hope, even when all seems lost. The journey to recovery is neither easy nor quick, but with perseverance and resilience, you can navigate your way through. I find myself compelled to write again, drawn by recent unexpected developments in my life that I'm still trying to fully comprehend. My efforts to break free from my past have surprisingly looped back in the most astonishing and convoluted manner. After revitalizing the store and enjoying our collective success, Marcus finding stability, Tom overcoming his struggles, and Lisa flourishing post-breakup, I felt for the first time that I was truly progressing, leaving my past behind. But then, unexpectedly, my parents appeared. I hadn't spoken to my parents since I headed off to college. Over the years, there were occasional messages from my mother, but I never responded. Reopening that chapter of my life didn't interest me. They had shown little concern for me as a child, so their sudden interest now seemed insincere. Yet, they had been quietly following my progress, and upon learning of my store's success, decided to show up. It was a busy Wednesday afternoon, post-lunch rush, and the store was teeming with customers. I was in the back office reviewing inventory when the sound of urgent knocking echoed through the space. Jamie, one of my employees, appeared at the door with a troubled look. "There's a man and a woman up front asking for you," she said, her tone hesitant. "They're, not very courteous." I instantly knew who it was. Walking into the main area, my suspicion was confirmed. There they stood, James and Sandra, imposing as if they still had any right to dictate my life. My father wore his characteristic scowl, his arms folded defiantly, while my mother seemed uneasy, her eyes nervously scanning the room as though she feared judgment. I paused momentarily, observing them. They looked the same, my father still exuding an aura of unwarranted authority, expecting deference, and my mother, as passive as I remembered, her demeanor anxious. Approaching them, I managed to keep my composure despite my racing heart. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone even. My father's response was derisive. "That's how you greet your parents after all this time? No wonder you turned out to be such a disappointment." I clenched my fist to contain my rising anger, refusing to let him provoke me. "What do you want?" I pressed, more firmly this time. "We heard about your success," my mother interjected, her voice softer than I recalled. "You've established a business, and we thought it might be time to reconnect." Her feigned concern was transparent. Reconnect? They had shown no genuine interest in my well-being during my upbringing, and now they expected to step into the role of caring parents? The idea of reconnecting was absurd. "We don't need to reconnect," I stated plainly. "Just get to the point." My father stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You owe us," he declared sharply. I was taken aback. "Excuse me?" I replied, incredulous. "You heard," he growled. "All your success, you owe it to the discipline we taught you on that farm. Who do you think instilled that strength in you? It was us. Without us, you'd be nothing." Their words were like a slap in the face. They had used me like a tool, not raised me like a son, and now they claimed credit for my achievements. "You didn't give me anything," I countered, my voice trembling with anger. "You exploited me. You mistreated me. I succeeded despite you, not because of you." That's when my father snapped. "You ungrateful brat," he yelled, his face reddening with fury. "We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us?" In a flash, he grabbed a baseball bat from a nearby display. My stomach dropped. I had arranged that display myself, never imagining it would be used like this. He swung the bat, and I dodged just in time. The bat struck the counter instead, the impact sending merchandise scattering as a loud crack echoed through the store. Customers screamed and scrambled for safety, panic engulfing the space. He lunged at me again, swinging the bat with reckless abandon. It clipped my shoulder, pain shooting through my body. I staggered backward, trying to gain distance, but he was relentless. "Think you can just walk away from us? Turn your back on your family?" he shouted, each word more frenzied than the last. All the while, my mother stood by, wringing her hands, doing nothing to intervene. Just as she always had, she watched passively as her husband attempted to assault their son. Fortunately, Jamie and other staff members had acted quickly, calling the police as soon as the disturbance began. The sound of approaching sirens finally made my father hesitate, but not before he struck me again, this time hitting my ribs. I fell hard, struggling to breathe, but I was determined not to let him see me defeated. Just then, the police stormed in, guns ready. They quickly subdued my father, pinning him to the ground as he shouted insults. My mother, finally realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to intervene and plead with the officers, but they arrested both of them and led them away. Sitting on the floor of my store, holding my side, I tried to process the chaos that had just unfolded. The physical pain was intense, but the emotional impact was even greater. After years of escaping the harsh life I had grown up in, my past had violently caught up with me. As my friends helped me up, I understood that this battle was far from over. Incredibly, my parents decided to sue me. They claimed I owed them for raising me and demanded emotional damages and a share of my business. The claim was ridiculous, but I realized this was more about them trying to maintain control than about the money. The lawsuit dragged on for months, becoming one of the most stressful times of my life. I had to repeatedly face the traumatic memories of my childhood as my parents portrayed themselves as the victims. They dredged up everything from my farm work to the strict discipline they imposed on me. It was horrifying, but I wasn't alone through this ordeal. My friends, Marcus, Tom, and Lisa, supported me every step of the way. They were there for every court date, every meeting with my lawyer, and during every moment of doubt when I felt overwhelmed. I couldn't have coped without them. The trial itself was intense. My father played up his role as a hurt father, claiming he had only wanted the best for me. My mother, always playing her part, occasionally shed fake tears and spoke about their supposed sacrifices for me, but the truth eventually surfaced. My lawyer, Rachel, a formidable woman who didn't tolerate nonsense, dismantled their claims one by one. She highlighted the years of abuse, the forced labor on the farm, and how they had treated me merely as a tool. She vividly illustrated to the courtroom the true nature of my parents. By the end of her arguments, no one in the courtroom could believe their deceit. The jury ruled in my favor. My parents' lawsuit was dismissed, and they were further burdened with counterclaims that plunged them into significant debt. The judge, appalled by their actions, ordered them to compensate for the damage they caused in my store. But the real twist of fate was when the judge sentenced them to 3 months of correctional labor. In an ironic turn of events, they were assigned to work on a farm, the very farm where I had spent my childhood under harsh conditions. They were now required to labor in the same grueling environment where they had once forced me to work. There was a sense of satisfaction in seeing them struggle with the same tasks that had once been my daily torment. It felt like a form of closure. For once, I held the upper hand. However, I didn't gloat or taunt them. That's not who I am. But I made sure they fully experienced the consequences of their actions. They had always preached that hard labor taught discipline. So, they received exactly that. They shoveled manure, carried hay, and worked till their hands were blistered and sore. And just as they had done to me, I ensured they didn't stop until the day's work was complete. Initially, they complained, claiming the work was too demanding and that they were too old for such labor. But the court was indifferent. The law didn't consider their feelings. They had brought this upon themselves, and now they had to face the repercussions. It didn't take long before they started to break down. The physical strain was evident, but it was the mental burden that truly wore them down. My father, once strong and commanding, began to falter. The man who had once dominated the farm with stern control was now just a weary old man, struggling to keep pace, and my mother, who had always lingered in the background, was now confronted with the harsh reality of their actions. There were fleeting moments when I almost felt pity for them. Almost. But then I would recall the years of abuse, the years I was treated merely as a tool for their gain, and any flicker of sympathy would vanish. They deserved every blister, every ache, and every bit of exhaustion they endured. By the end of their 3-month term, they were mere shadows of who they once were. The arrogance and entitlement had dissipated. During that time, their communication with me was minimal, and whatever little they said was terse. There were no apologies, no recognition of their wrongdoings. I didn't expect any. People like them don't change. They don't have an epiphany about their mistakes. But that was all right. I no longer needed their apology. After their sentence, they left the farm. I didn't see them off, and I've not heard from them since. To me, they are just ghosts of my past, echoes of a life I've moved beyond. The farm is now legally mine. After the trial, I was awarded the property. Though part of me wanted to erase its existence, I chose to transform it. The farm is no longer just a farm. It's been converted into a retreat, a place for others to find peace, to heal. It's ironic that the location, which was once my prison, has become a sanctuary for others. My life has transformed in ways I never imagined. The store is thriving, the farm has found a new purpose, and my bond with my friends is stronger than ever. We've each faced our own trials, but emerged tougher and more united. As for myself, I finally feel truly free. There are times when I think back on my past, on what my parents put me through, but those memories no longer control me. I've reclaimed my life, living it on my terms. So, the most important lesson I've learned is that regardless of how deep the scars are, or how heavy the burden of your past might be, you can rise above it. You can find freedom, even when it seems most unlikely.